sure every one of your houses looks just like that, doesn't it, huh? Well, before we get to Christmas, how about this? Raise your hand if you had a good Thanksgiving. Raise your hand, huh? No one's going to raise their hand if they had a miserable Thanksgiving, right? Did you get enough turkey and mashed potatoes? Put your hands up there. There, all right, good. And did you survive a weekend with either your in-laws or your grandkids who aren't physically possible? It's not possible for them to sit still. Did you survive? Huh? Well, and then there was football, right? There was the Vikings, right? Can I get a skull? Right. Oh, that's pathetic. Let's hear a skull, right? Anyone get this sort of eerie feeling that the world's about to end since the Vikings are 9-2? Like, something's just not right, huh? Well, folks, I love this time of year. I love this time of year. Part of why I love this time of year is that the holidays aren't really all that complicated for our family these days. Now, I don't want to say this to brag, but for our families, holidays aren't nearly as complicated as they used to be. And let me explain. A few years ago, as a family with a pastor, we made a decision. We decided, and maybe it's a little selfish, but we made a decision as our family, my wife, my boys, we decided that because of my line of work, and that I happen to work every holiday. It's part of the life of a pastor. It goes with the gig, you might say. We told our families that if you want to see us over the holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter for that matter, you know where we'll be. Huh? We'll be at home. Because it's just too complicated for us to travel. Things got way too nutty in our lives, and so we simply told our families that when it comes to holidays, you know where we'll be. Anybody jealous? Huh? And so for right now, for Katie and my boys and for myself, this time of year is really not all that complicated. In fact, we love this time of year right now. We love it because it wasn't all that long ago that this time of year was filled with all kinds of struggling and negotiating, trying to figure out whose house we would go to over Thanksgiving or Christmas, trying to orchestrate things so that we spent just enough time with everyone. We spent equal time with everyone, and yet not too much time with some family, if you know what I mean. And it always seemed to be this big struggle to get my entire family in one room at the same time. And it wasn't anybody's fault, and yet it heightened tensions in relationships, and there was old history that would get drug up, and somebody's feelings always got hurt, and it just got to be so complicated. Now, tell me I'm not the only one for whom this time of year brings complication for your family, huh? You chuckled a little bit. And yet it's at this time of year that we hear that old song, it's the most wonderful time of the year, right? Folks, at Christmas, doesn't Christmas sometimes seem so much more complicated than other times of the year? Things are more complicated because everything is sort of compressed. We've got this little window of time in which to squeeze in a year's worth of memories. You likely had a conversation, I'm guessing, at Thanksgiving with family. When are we going to celebrate Christmas, right? And then came the negotiating, right? Is this year we're with your parents or your parents for Christmas? Whose house are we going to gather at? I hope it's not Uncle Larry's. I hate sleeping on his futon. Who's bringing what food? Grandma cannot make Christmas dinner this year. It was like eating charcoal last year. How long are we going to be with your family? You know what they say about too much of a good thing. Are the adults exchanging presents? How much are we spending on presents? Oh, we're making presents this year? That's a great idea. Huh? It's complicated, right? It's complicated because everything is compressed. We've got these couple of days, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, and it's got to be just perfect because there's something magical, something we just can't be without, and you better not screw it up. And so we try to orchestrate, we try to navigate and officiate family coming together, and it's complicated. And so it makes me sort of grateful right now. at least for my family, it's not all that complicated. I say this because there have been times when it has been extremely complicated. For example, we all have our stories, our family stories, right? For a period of time, some of you know that my mother passed away, and for a period of time, as kids, we wanted to spend all kinds of time with my mother's side of the family at holidays. They had the fun cousins on that side of the family. But my dad was engaged to be remarried, and now there was this new family we were expected to get to know and spend holidays with. But if I were honest, we really didn't want to get to know them, especially at Christmas. Because they did Christmas all wrong. You see, they didn't get our Christmas traditions, and the Christmas traditions they had were just plain dumb, right? And this was hard because we loved my dad, and we knew we were supposed to embrace these new additions to our family, but it was complicated. And later, when Katie and I were first married, there was all these exhausting questions. How do we navigate the holidays with both our families? How do we keep everyone happy? How do we live up to our family's expectations? Raise your hand if you're sort of in this boat with me, right? You know what I'm talking about. And while we're at it, doesn't it seem that sometimes there's no winning at Christmas? Whatever decisions you happen to make about spending time with who and when, it leaves you feeling a little less than satisfied. Or you try and do the right thing when it comes to not going overboard with presents at Christmas, not burning up your credit card. But the fewer presents under the tree, you feel more and more like you're the Grinch who stole Christmas. And that's not to mention the lights on your house that stop blinking, and you have to put up that stinking Christmas tree. You got to put it together again, and the dog won't stop chewing on the Christmas decorations, right? We can't win. Christmas is complicated. Christmas, it has this way of sort of exaggerating all the bad. You know this, the tensions in our family that are just below the surface, and all our ill-advised intentions and our unrealistic expectations, while at the same time, you know this, Christmas points to something incredible. You see, Christmas is the most wonderful time of year, but it's not the most wonderful time of the year because of what's happening around us. Because for every one of us, at Christmas time, we're reminded of a few things. That there are problems we can't solve, there are people we can't control, and there are expectations we will never meet. And rather than the Norman Rockwell sort of perfect Christmas we see on TV, in most of our families, issues are exaggerated, emotions are heightened, budgets are stressed, and life feels heavier and at times darker at Christmas. Folks, Christmas is absolutely the most wonderful time of the year, not because of what is happening around us here and now. Instead, Christmas is absolutely the most wonderful time of the year because of what happened. If you've been around the church for a while, you likely know that in the Bible there are 4 different accounts, or 4 different versions of the story of Jesus' life. We in the church call them the Gospels. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And if you were to read through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the first 3 Gospels of the New Testament there, they all tell the story of Jesus' birth in a fairly similar way. They talk about Mary and Joseph traveling to Bethlehem. They talk about a stable and about angels. But the last Gospel, the book of John, tells Jesus' birth story in a very different way. You see, in the book of John, there is no birth story. There's no Bethlehem. There's no stable. There are no angels. There's none of that. And not only that, historians believe that of the 4 Gospels, John's Gospel was written the very latest of all 4 of them. And so historians believe that when John sits down to write his account of Jesus' life, it's believed that John was likely an old man. And so he sits down to write, and it seems like as he sits down to write this story of Jesus' life, it's as if he said, I've got to write this down because I don't have a lot of time left. I want to make sure that my kids and my grandkids and anyone who's willing to read this, that they know the story of Jesus' life. And you also should know that in John's lifetime, John experienced more pain, more loss, more heartache, violence, hurt than you and we could ever imagine. He'd lost his family, he'd lost friends, he'd lost his whole community. In his life, the Roman Emperor Nero ruled over the entire Roman Empire, and Nero had commanded his troops to make their way south from Rome. And systematically, they ransacked community after community all the way down until they made their way to Galilee. And they went through Galilee, destroying village after village after village. They slaughtered everyone and anyone in their way, and they carted off hundreds of thousands of Jews to Rome, where they were sold as slaves. In the year 70 AD, the Jewish War broke out. This was during John's lifetime, and John was either in or near Jerusalem when Nero's troops surrounded the entire city of Jerusalem for 7 whole months. No one could get in, nothing could get out. There were plagues, there was starvation. The Romans built a ditch around the entire city as well as a wall. I don't know why you need a wall as well as a ditch, but they did, right? And John was there when the Romans eventually demolished the city of Jerusalem, the holiest city in the entire world to any faithful Jew. They burnt the temple to the ground, the very place that Jews believed God actually lived. Millions of Jewish people were slaughtered. 200,000 were taken as slaves, carted off to Rome. John saw his friends, Peter, Paul, both executed by Nero. You see, John knew darkness like you and I can't even imagine. And yet John, at the end of his gospel, after telling the entire story of Jesus' life, he writes some words that we're going to take a look at today. Let's put them up on the screen. Oh, let's go to the next reading. There you go. That's better, right? Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. John says, all these pages and pages I've written about this guy Jesus, get this. It's only a taste of who he is. It's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to this guy. And then he goes on and he writes this. But these words, everything I've written down, I've written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, saying that someone was a Messiah was a big deal in that day. You see, it was an act of treason, punishable by death. The only one you called a Messiah was the emperor. Only the emperor with his swords and army and power and destruction and all the death he caused could be called the Son of God. But John doesn't stop there. He says, I've written all these things so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that through believing you may have life in his name. He said, I write all this so that through believing you might have a different kind of life than what's happening around you. In spite of all the death and the destruction, in the midst of all the pain and chaos he experiences, Jesus, he says, He's a Messiah who brings a totally different kind of life than that Nero. So we go to the beginning of what John wrote, and we're going to do that now. When John begins his story of Jesus' life, he doesn't begin with the birth story. There's no star, there are no angels, there's no shepherds or wise men. And actually, this is kind of crazy, because when Jesus is crucified, Jesus asks John to care for his mother, for Mary, after he's gone. To care for her, the Bible actually says, as though she were John's very own mother. And John did. He took care of Mary after Jesus had died. And so if anyone had heard the story of Jesus' birth, it's going to be John. Because John spent more time with Mary than anyone else. I imagine any moment John could, he asked Mary, Mary, tell me the story again. Tell me, what was it like being told that you were going to give birth to the Son of God? Tell me again, what was that night in Bethlehem like? What did the angels say? Mary, one more time. Where did those wise men come from? What was it like to have the shepherds there? Folks, John knew the story of Jesus' birth better than anyone else. But when John tells the story of Jesus' life, there are no shepherds, no wise men, no angels, no manger, no Bethlehem. Instead, John begins by putting into words the significance of the birth of Jesus. He just boils it down to just a few words, who this Jesus was. John begins the story of Jesus' life, not with a stable, but it goes like this. He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. But then listen to this. He says, what has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. In spite of all the darkness he had lived through, with all the pain, he said that this Jesus was life, real life. And that life was the light of what? All people. Let's try that again. The light was the what? Light of all people. This Jesus wasn't just for the Gentiles. He wasn't a Messiah just for a region or for a group of people. He wasn't just for the Jews. He was the light of all people. And that's when John goes on to write. He says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not. And I imagine he paused. I imagine he paused for just a minute, just to pick the exact right words. And then I imagine he said, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. In spite of all the death and destruction and people he loved being carted off, and his people, the Jewish people, basically being on the brink of extinction, the temple's destroyed forever. He saw Peter, his buddy, and Paul both executed. He was likely the last disciple standing. And I imagine with a grin on his face, John wrote these words. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. All the darkness, it won't extinguish this story of Jesus. It will never put it out. Caesar couldn't, Tiberius couldn't, Nero couldn't, destroying the temple couldn't, even Jesus' death couldn't put out the light. Folks, as John sat down as an old man to write the story of Jesus' life, and as he recalled all he had faced in his life, John believed. John knew inside, in his heart of hearts, no matter how messy things get, no matter how much pain you endure, how deep that depression gets, how lost you feel, how much heartache you know, how complicated life gets, there is a light that shines in the darkness. And nothing you'll ever face will ever extinguish it. There is no kind or type of darkness that can or will overcome or put it out. The Christmas song goes like this. It's the most wonderful. Well done. A round of applause for the musicians over here, right? It's the most wonderful time of the year. Folks, John tonight reminds us that Jesus was born at a time when things were so dark. And likewise, John himself, Jesus lived in a time when it was dark, and John himself lived in a time where there was more darkness than any of us could ever imagine. And folks, if we're honest, as we march through these next few weeks, as we jump into this season of Christmas, sometimes, I hate to tell you this, but you already know it. The season comes with its share of darkness. Because Christmas is complicated. Because at Christmas, it's at this time like no other that we're confronted with problems we can't solve, with people and family we can't control, with expectations that will never, ever be met. And so we love those lights on the Christmas trees because, like in John's day, things can sometimes seem a little dark. But John reminds us there is this light. There's this light. Folks, what makes this the most wonderful time of the year isn't what's happening here and now, but what has already happened. What happened in Jesus. The light of all people. The light that nothing will ever overcome. Not then, not now, not ever. Would you pray with me? Good and gracious God, as we dive into this season of Christmas, we hear that you are the light of all people. As we march into Christmas, let that be true for each one of us. Whatever we face this season, whatever empty seats might be at our Christmas dinner table, whatever the journey looks like, remind us that you come as light. And for this we give you thanks. Amen.